Next up, we've got Ben Neville, Associate Professor Ben Neville from UAM's University of Melbourne, Faculty of Business and Economics. Ben Neville is an Associate Professor in the Department of Management and Marketing, Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Ben researches and teaches in the area of sustainable business, including corporate social responsibility, business ethics, ethical consumption, and social entrepreneurship. His work investigates how business can be a force for both harm and good, including from strategic, ethical, political, and critical perspectives. At the university, Ben is a co-deputy director at Melbourne Climate Futures, the university's interdisciplinary initiative to accelerate the pathway to a positive climate future. Ben is also the Gourlay Fellow of Ethics in Business, the Sustainability in the Curriculum Fellow for the Faculty of Business and Economics, Coordinator of the Governance, Policy and Markets stream in the Master of Environment, and Program Director of the new Graduate Certificate in Sustainable Business. He's also the chair of the university's Fair Trade Steering Committee, and he's going to be talking to us today about pathways to net zero. So please give a round of applause for Ben Neville.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. I think we're all as excited as you are, and we really look forward to the visit after this session. I'm sure we can work out some sort of informal Uber system for those of you who need a lift. We can sort that out at the end of the session. I was just thinking, like this week has been, a wave of emotions, and Jimmy just added a few now. I've tended to feel fairly down about the situation we're in, listening to the climate scientists and others, during the week. And now I want to talk a bit more about business, and sometimes business might, I think, bring up some outrage in terms of, business is the reason why we've got ourselves into this situation. It is the production and consumption systems of which business has been the main decision maker, main control of those systems. So what I thought I would talk to you about firstly is, how is Australian business responding to the climate emergency? And then secondly, what can you do in your organisation to decarbonise? So thinking about decarbonisation pathways, what different businesses are doing, and then thinking about what you might be able to do in the organisations you might be in, whether they're non-profits or small businesses, etc. So just to really present, I think, a snapshot of where business in Australia is at, we can look at the Business Council of Australia, which represents the top about 120 corporations. And going back to the 2019 election, they were very much behind the coalition government at that point. Their 26 to 28% target that they had, and refusal to go any higher. And you can see there underlined that alleged that Labor's emission target would be economy wrecking. Right. So that voice of business, you can imagine how influential that would be in terms of an impact upon politics and upon elections. But in the most recent election, they have changed their tune over the previous 3 years. They've very much gotten on board with climate action, and there was one day in the election where the coalition government started the horrible, pathetic arguments, just sort of dragging us down again. And within hours, the Business Council spoke out and said, "This is, get back in your box. No, we are, having a mature conversation about this, and we back Labor's, policies," which was basically, their own policies about using the safeguard mechanism. And so that was such an important intervention in the campaign. So, I think that sort of is a really good, snapshot in terms of where we're at. This was a survey by Deloitte. They surveyed 2,000 C-suite executives across the globe. I think it was 20 odd countries. And you can see there's some of the Australian data. The majority of Australian executives say their companies are very concerned about about climate change. So the conversations are happening, at the big end of town, and especially as the younger generations are pushing out typically the old white men. The conversations are getting better and better. However, you can see down the bottom there, disconnects exist between ambitions, actions, and impacts. So there is good conversations are happening, really smart people in high positions, really, fantastic people, but there are still some of the old dinosaurs there as well. And so the actions, are not urgent enough as yet. The RBA there, you can see Guy Debelle, the old ex-deputy governor, reported that 49 of the ASX 200 have a net zero policy. So that was in October last year. So, leading companies are, increasingly getting on board with targets and strategies and actions. But then on the right-hand side, you can see the Australian electricity companies not reducing emissions in line with Paris Agreement goals. So we have this sort of very mix, in terms of some companies really getting forward and leading while others are still, laggards, and, with all the mix in between. And, we have to, this is where the outrage comes in. We have to, acknowledge that business, especially, the fossil fuel industry, the energy industry, has been behind the climate denial. Very recently came out the car industry, so the car industry peak body had a secret emissions plan to slow electric vehicle uptake. I read that it's largely that body is represented by basically how many cars you sell. So Toyota sells the most cars in Australia. They get the biggest voice in that peak body, and we know that they are behind many of the other companies, which is such a shame because a decade and more earlier they were sort of ahead of the game. It's such a shame. So, extraordinary that, two former prime ministers, who probably hated each other, in Parliament would get together to speak out, against right-wing politics, media and vested interests. So, let's not forget the role of News Corp here in continually dragging things down. The bottom right, there's some evidence there of the American electric utility industry's role in promoting climate denial, doubt and delay. They have financed this. They have used not just their lobbying but their marketing machines to finance the climate denial movement, giving the messages that then go on Fox News, etc., that have had such devastating impact. Now, in terms of understanding, where companies are at now in terms of the targets that they might have, we know now that Australia has a 43% target. We distinguish between three categories: so scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So scope 1 emissions, the direct emissions from your operations. So they're the emissions that come out of your smokestacks and your exhaust pipes of the facilities that you own. Scope 2 are those indirect emissions from production of the energy you consume. So when you buy electricity if that's being produced by coal-fired power stations, then you have a responsibility for choosing green power, let's say. So you need to be including that in your emissions footprint. And then scope 3 are all those other emissions, the indirect emissions that are embedded in your supply chain. So both upstream in terms of all the inputs that you use to sort of produce whatever product or service you produce, and then also downstream in terms of what others in your supply chain or consumers actually do with those products. Right? So this is really important for fossil fuels. 90 to 95% of the emissions of fossil fuel companies are scope 3 emissions because they are burned by customers. If you think about oil companies, the emissions are produced when we drive our cars. And we still have, fossil fuel companies today still, refusing to accept responsibility for those emissions, even though quite clearly they are the ones that, it's like a drug dealer, selling heroin and then, taking no responsibility for it, Woodside, for example, they've actually offset their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but, deny any responsibility for those scope 3 emissions. So here's some examples of corporate climate targets referring to scope 1, 2, and 3. Woolworths, I think they're generally pretty good, and Coles has come in pretty quickly behind them as well. So you can see their scope 1 and 2, and reducing scope 3 emissions 19% from 2015 baseline by 2030. Think about how many products that they have on their shelves, which they choose. Right? What products get put on their shelves? They therefore have a responsibility. They have influence, right? And so such a big job, right? But again, there are very good people doing that. BHP, another one there, scope 3 again is important for them. If you think about, iron ore, when we talk about green hydrogen, it's often, focused on how we actually make steel. To make steel, you have to heat, the metals at very, very high temperatures, of which pretty much, the only technology really at the moment is the coking coal, the metallurgical coal. But that's where we need the green hydrogen. So what responsibility does BHP have? Can they just sell the iron ore off to others to, ship to China to then, to smelt and make the steel? Do they, can they just wash their hands of it? So they're accepting some responsibility for it. Perhaps they can get, take on a little bit more responsibility, but they're certainly accepting that responsibility. Finance industry has moved quite substantially over the last few years. That's uni super, which many of us, academics in the room will have our super with uni super. They've, we're fairly slow, but have taken on some pretty good targets in the last couple of years. The one down the bottom, I think, is a really interesting one there. They're in a coalition called I haven't looked at it for a while, Climate Leaders Alliance, something like that, with a number of other superannuation companies who have committed to using their power in the market to contribute to a 45% reduction in Australia's emissions by 2030. So this is probably about 2 years old now, that policy. So that was when the current federal government had a 26 to 28% targets. So they were committing to do more than government, to get involved, get engaged, use their power and influence. And then down the bottom, you can see the University of Melbourne, carbon neutral by 2025 on scopes 1, 2, and 3, climate active certified, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and then carbon positive by 2030. So for us in the university sector, I mean, we are a little slow compared with many other universities, but it is the scope 3 commitment that we have made that sort of differentiates our commitment. But yeah, I'm not sure the leadership really appreciate what they've committed to. I was part of the team that did get that through. Climate Works at Monash University have done some fantastic work in tracking, corporate commitments, and so these are some of the summaries of their assessment October last year, as you can see. So in their net zero commitments, companies are consistently underestimating how significant the change needs to be. So they're making these commitments, beginning to do actions, but it's not fast enough. It needs to be more urgent. Net zero commitments are overwhelmingly focused on reducing operational emissions, scope 1 and 2, not yet scope 3 enough. Many net zero commitments are not backed by sufficient action. You can make a commitment for a target, but then you've got to follow through and actually do it, right? So that's then the next, when we need to sort of, respect that it's all part of a journey. Often the commitments do need to come before the actions, but nevertheless, the actions do need to follow. Net zero commitments must be examined to determine whether offsets are being used only for unavoidable emissions. I'll mention offsets again, but they're where a lot of the current controversy lies, I guess. I'll just sort of quickly go through a bit of this, but just to give you a sense of, why has corporate Australia, why are we now seeing some more positive actions and positive commitments and leadership often? And certainly they stepped up in the last in this last electoral cycle with, the federal government, being completely AWOL on this. They sort of realized that they had to step up within that vacuum. But other countries' governments are also have been increasing their targets, especially sort of Japan and Korea, some of our big sort of consumers of our coal, when they increase their targets, like, okay, so our coal markets are disappearing. Of course, China has stopped buying our coal. A really interesting one that was very much noticed by corporate Australia was the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is not in place yet, but it's being talked about as something that's going to happen. Essentially, it will be a tariff that the EU will put on their border for, so they have a carbon trading mechanism, a scheme where companies within the European borders have to pay, a carbon price. So it's then unfair for companies from other countries to sort of export their goods into Europe and get that advantage, right? And so it completely makes sense that you'd put a tariff on the border to sort of equalize things. And so that was very much noticed and very influential. The Australian regulators have really come on board in the last few years. In 2016, there was, I think, a genius move by the Centre for Policy Development. John Wiseman in the back has a role there. I don't know if you had much influence over the Hutley opinion, but they got a very well-respected Australian barrister to make a legal opinion about whether directors of corporations need to take into account climate risk, and he found that they do. It's under corporate law, and then that message was heard by the regulators and has been very influential. So following that, APRA, ASIC and the RBA have all been getting on board to differing extents and providing guidance now for companies to integrate, especially climate risk. So APRA at the moment have asked the top 5 banks to stress test all their mortgage portfolios to see, what sort of financial risk there is if, they have loaned money to people whose houses are going to get burnt in bushfires or lost in floods, etc. Other business partners, there's been strong influence by the large corporations. When Woolworths says, tell us, yes, we will buy your products, but you have to tell us, what the emissions are embedded in these products. That message gets filtered down, has been very influential. The cheaper cost of renewables and offsets has been, very influential in terms of making it look easy, to actually transition. I'll talk a bit more about offsets later. The Business Council of Australia, also AI Group. So the Business Council has the top 120. AI Group has 15,000 or something other, below that of small, small and medium-sized enterprises. They've been much more progressive on climate change than the Business Council. The very well led Tennant Reid is their climate expert and is very good. Also overseas, the US Business Roundtable, the World Economic Forum, speaking very positively about climate action. And then we have the individuals who are sort of stepping up and leading, Twiggy Forrest, where he has come from, for him to then get involved in economic transition, really speaks to the front pages of the Australian Financial Review. And, news media cannot, sort of deny what he is doing. Mike Cannon-Brookes, I think, really needs to be celebrated, especially with, his attempt to take over AGL. It was both courageous, but also, innovative in terms of, the commercial ideas that he was trying to put in place. And Elon Musk, love him or hate him, and, it's probably a mixture of all, but nevertheless, the celebrity status that, that he has in the world has been, highly influential. There is a growing number of, ethical consumers, a growing segment. Often it is their intentions that speak more loudly in market research than what it does actually in markets. And there's a whole sort of issue around that. But nevertheless, corporate leaders see it. One of in sustainability generally, one of the real triggers has been millennials coming into the workforce, sort of 15 odd years ago. And when you know, sort of HR professionals are then interviewing them for their jobs, and they get the best students from University of Melbourne and other places around, and they say, "Do you have any questions for us?" Which in my day was all, no, I just want to get out of here as quickly as possible, But they would say, "Yes, tell me about your sustainability strategy. What are you doing on climate?" And that message filtered back, right, and has been very influential. Still, the strongest sort of all the stakeholder relationships in terms of financial impact, it's still employees typically are that strongest relationship. If you want to get the best and if you want to keep the best, turnover is very expensive for companies, then you need to get on board and have a good sustainability strategy. And then lastly, shareholders are also getting on board. We've talked about finance and superannuation before, but activists have also recognised the power of the shareholder, and there's been some very interesting litigation going on as well. There's a very interesting one at the moment with Santos, where the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility are taking them to court, not based on sort of corporate shareholder law, but on consumer law, that they have been lying to consumers that gas can be a green fuel, that it can be a transition fuel, which, if you don't know, it's I think it's about 98% as bad as coal, because it hasn't been counted correctly. They did more correct measurements about 3 years ago. And so that message that it's a transition fuel really needs to be put aside. All right, now I want to talk about, what you can do in your organization to decarbonise. So, thinking about, what can you do? Of course, it is, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So the big end of town has to carry the biggest responsibility, but ultimately to get to net zero, we all have to do it, right? We all have to get on board. All right, so this can apply to you in whatever organisation you're in. So this is a typical sort of pathway that of various steps that you might take. You might see them in different orders, and we don't need to get caught up necessarily in the order, but to know that it is all a sort of an ongoing process. The first thing that perhaps you might like to do is actually reflect on, how is climate actually going to impact your business, both in terms of the risks and opportunities. I'll unpack some of these a little bit, but also just to reflect on, how does your organisation think about its relationship with nature? Generally speaking, we have abused Mother Nature, and that greater relationship needs to be reconsidered. You need to be measuring what your carbon footprint is. That includes CO2, but also other non-carbon greenhouse gases. There's been a bit of conversation about methane today. You then need to set targets, and the typical one is the longer term target of net zero by 2050, but it is important to also have those shorter and mid-term targets, whether it's 2025, 2030. How are you going to get there? We can't leave it all. We've already left it too late, right? We've got to get on straight away, and to think about them in terms of scopes 1, 2, and 3. What actions then can we take? And that's where the rubber really hits the road. So mitigation, how can we reduce our emissions, but also thinking about adaptation. How can we actually adapt to the climate change that we will be observing, we will be experiencing? And capital allocation, if you don't put money to it, then people in your organisation are just going to be fighting uphill. Right, it needs to have money allocated to it, otherwise it can just be sort of lip service. Then there's the issue of offsetting, right? So offsetting is very commonly used in Australia. And there are different schools of thought about offsetting. There is one that's very critical of offsetting because it's perceived as just being a delaying tactic from doing real action, and there's absolutely something in that, but it can also in the meantime fund really great projects, some of which we have heard and will hear more about this week. And then the last one then is enablers. You know, you also have to put in place other structural changes to be able to sort of really entrench this change. And so internal governance, large corporations have to put in place sort of reward systems for their leaders. Otherwise, you know, things won't change, you know, so there needs to be bonuses, you know, etc. for, you know, achieving these sorts of changes. If it's not linked to it, then you know, it's not going to happen. And external leadership as well. It's not just, you know, businesses need to step up within their industries and within, you know, the political sector broadly to continue to influence. So just in terms of then unpacking a little bit understanding climate risk. So the way that we typically categorise climate risk, this comes from APRA, so the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority that oversees the banking system. They talk about physical risk, transition risk, and liability risk. So physical risk is the risk that essentially your property is going to burn down or get flooded, right? Or blow away, I suppose. Transition risk is the risk that whatever markets you're in, the products that you sell, that in a changing market that's responding to climate change, that your customers will leave you, right? So if you're selling coal, your customers will leave you. If you're selling petrol-driven cars, your customers will leave you, and you'll have stranded assets. So that's that transition risk. And then liability risk is the risk that you might get sued for it, you know, whether as a company or as the corporate leaders individually might get sued. Commonwealth Bank very recently have just, and this is in response to that APRA stress testing, they've just put out their climate report 2022. So $45 billion of home loans are at risk, which is 5% of their total loan book, right? So that's pretty significant in terms of, you know, if you think about, you know, how much they are profiting, or, you know, any sort of measure of how much that might be, that's certainly a number that's going to very much get noticed by leaders. So you can see there the number of properties that are at risk of cyclones, floods, or fire that they have counted. But there's another risk that typically is lost and not considered, and that is the broader systemic risk. Right? And it frustrates me all the time that they don't mention this, and that is the risk that that our entire economy, society, political systems will begin to degrade and collapse, you know, as climate change gets worse and worse. There has been this belief that you know, when companies do these scenario analyses, you know, you see we've looked to, you know, we've mapped to a 3-degree future, and we think that we'll be perfectly fine, right? And it's absurd, right? I've been very pleased to see, this was, I think, in the paper yesterday. You see that David Neal, who's IFM investors, $200 billion, saying, you know, you can't stock pick your way out of environmental collapse, right? That's precisely the point. These companies believe that as things get worse, they're going to be able to, you know, you just don't give a mortgage to people in bushfire prone areas. You just don't give a mortgage to people where you know, floodwaters are going to rise, and we'll be fine, right? But in an economy where it's, you know, going to be affected widely, everybody's going to be affected. You know, it's so few companies do well in an economic recession, and yet, you know, 99% of the companies in Australia, 100% have said that they think that they're going to do all right. Another approach that's similar is around scenario analyses, and many companies are doing this now. This is from the NGFS. It's the Network on Governing the Financial System. It's a sort of UN level. It's a body where all the sort of the central banks sort of feed into, and they have recommended these scenarios, whether we move to orderly or, you know, our pathways out of this are orderly or disorderly, and the extent to which there is physical risk. But you can see down, you know, on that hothouse world one in the bottom right, you know, they think there's going to be, that's I think it's 2.4 to 4.6 degrees that is in that scenario, and you know, they think that there's going to be low transition risk. They're still going to be able to be selling as much coal and petrol driven cars as it. So it's, yeah, I think there's still a little bit of thinking on that. When it comes to measuring your emissions, emission factors are very, very helpful. And so you go through your scopes 1, 2, and 3, and then emission factors are essentially industry averages. So whatever you are consuming, whether it's, you know, gas or, you know, lab coats or pens or anything, you know, there is an industry average that you can use to work out your footprint. And you can see there the scope 3 categories on the right hand side. Number 6, business travel is a big one for universities. There is 2 main mechanisms that you can look at in terms of certifying your decarbonisation pathway. In Australia, the Australian government has the climate active approach. If you they own the trademark for being carbon neutral. So you can only claim carbon neutrality if you've gone through climate active, compared with the UN-based science-based targets initiative. The main difference is about their attitude towards offsetting. The climate active is very open and free about offsetting and certifies those offsets. So, which gets us to the issue of offsetting. I mentioned, you know, there's especially great opportunities in the Indigenous space, and I think we'll hear from Anna tomorrow talking about the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network. But offsets are very controversial. Their integrity has been called into question, and Andrew McIntosh suggesting that 80% of them are a sham, right? Which suggests then that the cost of offsets is about 20% of what it should be, right? And so currently now we have the Chubb review looking into offsets, and Rich Eckhart up the back was asked to contribute to that and has put in his contribution, and so yeah, he can tell you all about it. But I think one of the really interesting things about this, about having an artificially low price of offsets, has been that it's made it very easy for companies to go down this decarbonisation pathway, but now they are locked into that commitment, right? So now, as we should expect quality of offsets to go up and the price to go up, they will need to stay within that. All right, I'm out of time, but just to show you what we've done at the University of Melbourne in terms of scope 2, 1, 2, and 3, and yeah, we can explore them a little bit more later if you'd like. Thank you.